Hey guys, Adam here with AmericanTrucks.com. Today we're taking a closer look at and installing the Supreme Suspension's 2.5-inch Pro Billet front strut leveling kit spacers available for the 2007 to 2018 Silverado 1500. You should be checking out a 2.5-inch leveling kit like this one here from Supreme Suspensions if you're looking to get rid of that factory rake, which to a lot of guys, including myself, do think that it is ugly off the factory line. Now, if you're not familiar with what exactly rake means, it's basically the height that your truck comes with off of the factory. The height from the factory gives you a higher rear end than your front end in order to compensate for added weight when you're towing or hauling any added weight to the rear end. Now, if you don't like the look of that, or if you're not really towing and hauling a lot of things very often, you might want to get rid of it and level out that front end with the rear. It makes for a better, more aggressive stance on your truck. It gives you a little bit more ground clearance at the front end, and it allows for slightly bigger tires with minimal modification. First off, leveling the truck, that's an obvious explanation, right? It brings your front end up about 2.5 inches. It gives you that completely leveled ride height as you see on our 2010 right behind me. Second, it gives you a little bit more ground clearance. Raising the front end 2.5 inches means that that front end is gonna be off the ground a little bit higher, so attacking small, very minor obstacles will be a little bit easier with your higher front end. Third, adding a slightly bigger wheel and tire, like a set of 33s for example, will become a little bit easier with a 2.5-inch leveling kit at the front end. That is the absolute bare minimum you need as far as a leveling kit or lift kit at the front end to fit bigger wheels and tires. But there is one exception. When you add a 2.5-inch lift or leveling kit like we did here at the front, 33s do fit with minor modification, meaning minor trimming, to the interior wheel well liner of your truck. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be cutting away any metal or anything like that, but your tires, especially if you're running mud terrains like you see behind me, will come in contact with that liner, making it impossible to make full turns at full wheel lock. You will have severe rubbing and you will have to do a little bit of cutting for the wheel well liner to make that work, but it is doable. 35s, out of the question, still not drivable at all, so we're not even gonna show you guys that, but we did wanna show you what the truck would look like with a set of 33s on and what that rubbing looks like as you see here. Now, if you wanted to pick up the 2.5-inch leveling kit, it is one of the most affordable things you can do to your suspension as a Silverado owner. The Supreme Suspension 2.5-inch kit comes in at about $90 for the two spacers, the hardware necessary to get it installed, and the install instructions are included in the kit. Speaking of the installation, I'm going to take you guys step by step on how to uninstall the factory front end to get ready to install your CNC machined solid block billet aluminum spacers that do, by the way, have a black anodized finish on top to help with maximum corrosion resistance. They're a pretty solid look. They definitely have a lot of durability to them, so once we do have it installed, you can rest assured that it's not going to bend, crack, or break once the full load is on top of them and when they're taken on the trails, if that's what you're doing, or if you're just hitting the highway. Now, with that installation, I'm giving it a 2 out of 3 wrenches on our difficulty meter, bordering on the line of maybe 3 out of 3 wrenches. The reason I say that is because taking apart your front end suspension does take a little bit of mechanical knowledge. You want to make sure you're doing everything properly, because if it's not done properly, there can be pretty dangerous circumstances. But for now, let's take a look at the install. Tools used for this install are an impact gun, 21mm deep socket, 19, 17, and 15mm deep sockets, 13mm and 10mm deep sockets, and a 17mm short socket. Universal swivel joint, Allen key or Allen socket, 18mm ratcheting wrench, extension, 15mm wrench, hammer, cutting tool, vice grips, needle nose pliers, 1/2-inch and 3/8 ratchets, Phillips head and flathead screwdrivers. Now, the first step of our installation, of course, is to get these big wheels and tires off, but I wanted to give you guys a quick note. We are working with aftermarket wheels and tires. As you can see, what we have here are a set of 32s. From the factory, your Silverado would have came with 31 and change, somewhere around 31.6, so not too big of a difference as far as size is concerned, but I just wanted to make that quick note before we move forward. I'm gonna break out our T40 Torx bit to get these aftermarket wheel caps off. Once we have them taken off, we'll tackle the lug nuts and do the same thing on the other side. At this point, you can use your 15mm deep socket to remove the top bolt on your sway bar end link, and then pop off the bushings and remove the end link itself. All right, the next step is to disconnect our brake line bracket, which attaches right here to our hub assembly. There's a 10mm bolt here, then we'll follow this up and disconnect those little Christmas tree clips. All right, that loosens up that bracket. If you follow that brake line bracket all the way up here, up on the upper control arm, we're gonna remove that. Keep following it up here, there's another one up here. You just don't wanna put pressure on this later on when we start lowering things after it's all disconnected. The next step is to remove the nut holding on our tie rod end to the knuckle. Now this is going to be a 21mm socket. Now before you tackle this, if you're using a lift on your truck, you want to have a pole jack supporting your entire assembly here. If you're on the ground, make sure you have a hydraulic jack, something that you can adjust and lower once we start disconnecting everything. So first things first, grab a 21mm and disconnect your tie rod end. Now what I like to do before we can disconnect this is to just lightly thread the nut back on to one thread, and then grab a mallet or hammer and knock this loose. Now we can take the nut back off, pop the tie rod end out, and I like to thread the nut back on just so you don't lose it. All right, the next step in the process is to disconnect the ball joint for our upper control arm, and you're gonna need a 17mm short socket for this castle nut. There's also a pin that goes straight through that, so you might wanna remove that before you get started. We've already done that since it's very hard to show on camera. This I'm gonna use a 3H ratchet for and a 17mm deep socket. Slide this in here. I already broke mine loose, but if you're having trouble with this and you don't have a lot of space to work with any impact guns or anything with a little more torque, what I would suggest doing is putting the ratchet up against the strut and using that as a breaker bar. From there, you can actually just rotate this and it gives you a little bit more leverage to crack that loose. All right, once you have that loosened by hand, just go ahead and take that castle nut all the way out. You want to make sure you have it all the way out before you do this next step. So we got this all the way out, we know that it's completely loose. We're gonna thread it on one thread, just so we can use a hammer to knock our upper control arm loose without it jolting everywhere. This will at least catch it. All right, so now we're gonna grab our ball peen hammer, knock our upper control arm loose, and then we'll remove our hand threaded castle nut. All right, the next step here is to loosen up the 3 nuts at the top of our strut tower. Now I'm using an 18mm ratcheting wrench because I think this makes life a little bit easier. You can use a ratchet and socket, and if you really want to make your life easier, you could remove this entire interior wheel well. I have this little gap here, and the ratcheting wrench definitely makes it easier, so I'm just going to go with this. All right, now repeat that for the other 2 studs. All right, the next step here is to loosen up and remove the bolts on the bottom of your shock. Those are 15mm, so grab your socket and get those off. Now we can pop out our factory strut. Now that we have our factory strut out of our Silverado and on the table, it's time to assemble our leveling kit spacer. Now the spacer is going to attach right to the top of our strut, and it's going to use the factory studs to bolt this on. We're going to be attaching new studs to act as our old studs to attach the strut to our Silverado suspension. Now before we can move forward with anything, I'm going to be using blue Loctite on the new studs as well as the old studs to make sure that our spacer stays put and doesn't shimmy around or loosen up any of the new or old studs. So that's a really good idea. It's not included in the kit, but getting a little piece of blue Loctite will definitely go a long way. When you're using blue Loctite, you just need a little dab at the end, and that'll thread all the way through. With blue Loctite on the end, we're gonna pick up our spacer, go onto the back side here, and thread our new studs in. You want to thread it all the way in so that the head of the bolt is all the way in this open socket. Now I'm going to be using a 5/16 Allen key to tighten it down. A T40 Torx bit also does the trick, and you want to make sure you're torquing it down to spec. Do the same thing for the other 2 studs. Now before we bolt our spacer to the strut itself, we're going to use blue Loctite again on the bottom end of the factory studs on the top of our strut. Now the reason we're going on the bottom end is because that is going to be where the nut is tightening down to. It's not going to be tightened at the top, it'll be tightened at the bottom, so we want to make sure we get a really good bond between the spacer and the strut. We don't want that loosening up and moving around. We're going to take our blue Loctite and dab that bottom. All right, now that we can take our spacer and put it through the 3 studs. Now keep in mind it only goes on one way, so if it doesn't line up, just rotate the spacer until it does. See, like mine is not lining up, so I'm gonna rotate to the next holes and it drops right on. Now that the studs are through the top here, we're gonna take a flat washer, a lock washer, and our 17mm nut and thread it on the end here. Once that's in place, do that for all 3. And then grab a 17mm deep socket and tighten it down. Now the next step in the process here, since we've got it all assembled, we actually have to take a die grinder and grind down the top of our factory studs. As you can see, they stick out just a little bit, and really it's just like a 1/4 inch, maybe not even that sticks out past the top of the spacer. We need to make that flush. Otherwise, it's going to prohibit this from getting a really tight bond inside the truck. We want to make sure it has a flush surface when we're installing it. So we've got a die grinder here, just going to nip off the top of these factory studs, get them nice and flush, and then we'll go back into the Silverado. Once you finish grinding down the first one, it's completely flush. Move on to the next 2 studs. All right, now that we have all of our grinding taken care of, it's time to get our strut back into our Silverado. So let's get to it. Now that we're back in our Silverado, it's time to put our strut back into place. Now we're gonna feed it underneath of our upper control arm and line it up with the 3 factory holes at the top. Keep in mind it only goes on one way, so you might have to keep rotating it to get it to line up. Once it goes in, seat it on those factory open holes on the lower control arm. From here, you might want to lift it up and thread on the factory nuts to the top of those studs. All right, with them hand threaded at the top end, that's holding it in place. Now we can bolt it down from the bottom. All right, now at the bottom end of our shock, we're going to take our factory shock bolts, put them through the open hole underneath of our lower control arm, thread them through the hole on the bottom of our shock. Grab your 15mm deep socket and tighten them down. All right, next step here is to put a pull jack under our lower control arm, jack it up so that we can lift the knuckle to line up with the upper control arm ball joint. All right, with our upper control arm through the top of the knuckle, we're gonna put our pin back through. You wanna make sure you're rotating that castle nut enough so that it has the open access hole. Stick that pin straight through, bend it from the other side. Next up here is our tie rod end. So remove that nut that we threaded back on, lift that up, and you can of course rotate the hub assembly and rotate the stud on the bearing. Line that up, get that to go through. Once you have that threaded on, grab your 21mm deep socket and tighten it down. Next up is our sway bar end link included in the kit. We're gonna do a bare bar with a bushing and spacer underneath, followed by another bushing facing downward, and then a spacer before we go through the top of our sway bar. Next is gonna be the sleeve, followed by the sleeve will be spacer, bushing facing upward. From here, this is where we're gonna go through the sway bar. The next step here is to reconnect our brake line bracket. Now that's gonna go right to the top of the knuckle with a 10mm factory bolt. Tighten that down. Once that's taken care of, the plastic Christmas tree clips will go right onto the top here of our upper control arm. And finally, the last one is gonna reattach right to the top. The brake line bracket, reattaching those clips is the last step of the process, so repeat this entire thing for the opposite side. Now that's going to wrap up my review and install of the Supreme Suspension's 2.5-inch Pro Billet leveling kit spacers for the front end of your 07 to 18 Silverado 1500. Now if you want to pick up the Supreme Suspension kit here for about $90, you can do so at AmericanTrucks.com.